Welcome to the first ever edition of Queen's Park Q&A with our guest, MPP for Timmins-James Bay, Gilles Bisson. Mr. Bisson will answer questions submitted by you, our Speaking of Timmins listeners. Our first question for you, Mr. Bisson, today is from Billy Wonka. The closing of the Resolute Mill in Iroquois Falls will obviously have a major impact on that community. What can elected officials of all levels do to help avoid the increasing impact that lobby groups based in Southern Ontario and with deep pockets are having on the Northern Ontario resource industry?
Well, first of all, the closure of the mill is obviously devastating, not only for Iroquois Falls, but for the region. And what's really, I think, shocking about this particular story is that it doesn't need to be so. Is that in the case of Kapuskasing, in the case of Sault Ste. Marie, and many other communities across the north, the NDP, when we were in government, found ways of sitting down with communities, sitting down with employers, and trying to find a way to be able to get their bottom line down so that they're able to stay open. And what is shocking with this government is that they're not even having that discussion. It seems to me the first thing a provincial government should be doing when they see an employer like this saying, I'm closing my doors and I'm going away, is to say, all right, what can we do to help? And clearly there's some issues here that the government has some control on that they would be able to approach to help Resolute hopefully reverse that decision. And if they're not willing to reverse a decision, then the second discussion's got to be, all right, we need to find a successor employer. And that means that the province has got to take the wood back, got to hold on to it. And it doesn't give it to anybody other than somebody who's prepared to reopen something in Iroquois Falls. And you have to secure the assets, because until you can figure out what the next use of that fiber is going to be, is it another type of paper machine? Is it another type of a product? You've got to be able to freeze those assets, and I think that's the bigger thing. So the best lobbying that can be done, to answer your question, I think has to be done by the people here in Northern Ontario. And for this to happen, the municipality's got to be on side. It's got to be front and center, and it's got to be the one really helping to put the pressure on the government in order to sit down and have this discussion about can we do in order to try to approach the cost issues that Resolute says it has. And number two, if they're not going to stay, what do we do in order to be able to find a successor employer?
Our next question is from Pauline Black. The high cost of hydro is a question that comes up a lot on local social media pages. Can you speak to what can potentially be done to help our hydro rates be more on par with the hydro costs in provinces such as Quebec?
Well, the first thing we do is we get rid of the Liberal government and the Tory government. We're into this situation because first the Conservatives, followed by the Liberals, who accelerated privatization, started to not only privatize a lot of our electricity system, but deregulated parts of it as well. And so what we now have is a hybrid model that's not completely privatized, not completely deregulated, and sits somewhere in between a fairly open system and a control system, publicly owned, such as you see in Quebec. So my argument would be not to do what the Conservatives want, which is to complete the privatization. My argument is that we need to start thinking about what are we going to do over the longer run in order to get energy prices under control. Well, the first thing I think we need to do is stop building all of these private power plants that we don't need. Ontario has a capacity of generating 35,000 megawatts per year on demand at any one time, and we're currently using about 20,000 megawatts. So we've got roughly 15,000 megawatts that we don't need, and we're dumping that into the United States for either free or for pretty darn cheap, or some of it, in order to be able to offset and balance the system. So the first thing you got to do is stop making these private power deals that the Liberals have done that really has bankrupted our system. The second thing you've got to do is that you have to say, all right, as these contracts come to an end, we need to sit down and figure out which ones are we able to keep and which ones do we just not renew. Because we've signed very lucrative power deals that go anywhere from 10 to 20 years, where we're paying the private sector to generate power far more than what it costs us in the public sector to do it under what used to be Ontario Hydro. The reason Quebec has cheap energy prices, the reason Manitoba has cheap energy prices, is because they run a public utility, and the public utility says we will generate power at cost plus whatever it costs to update and keep our system running. And so they're able to generate electricity at less than half the price of what we pay here in Ontario. So we need to undo the damage done by both the Conservatives and Liberals when it comes to energy policy, and I just talked a couple of ways that we need to be able to do that.
Our next question is from Sarah Wright. Is there anything that can be done to encourage the provincial government to revisit the disbursements offered through the Northern Ontario Travel Grant? as it only covers a small portion of travels to places like Toronto, where she, Sarah, and others from throughout Northern Ontario often have to spend more than one day for tests and results and incur hotel bills and flights and extra meals.
I think the first emphasis has to be on trying to, as much as possible, providing services in our home communities or as close to home as possible. You'll never provide an entire, array of services to every community in Northern Ontario. The population base isn't there to be able to do that. But we can certainly offer far more services on a regional basis, which means to say people have to do as many overnight trips as they do now if they've got to go down to Sudbury, or they've got to be able to go down to Toronto or Ottawa. So I think the first thing is that we really need to look at how do we offer as much of the health services as we can within our home communities or as close to our home communities as possible. And that would lessen the dependence on the travel grant. As far as the travel grants itself, yes, I think it's in need of some modernization. There hasn't been changes to it in a few years. I think what we need to look at is the reality is people need to be able to go away for, a night or two to have tests or do whatever it is that they got to get done when it comes to treatment in places like Sudbury and Toronto and Ottawa. Currently, they're paying, I believe, it's $100 flat fee per night. That doesn't cover your meal. It doesn't cover your hotel room. So I think it's in keeping that we look at how do we increase it somewhat. It'll never cover the entire cost, but I think what we need to do is to make it as financially we have to make it so that people are not, put behind the eight ball financially because they have to go for a treatment in Toronto or Sudbury.
Mark Granth wants to know, with the recent election of Mayor Black in Timmins, many in the community are wondering how you and he, who were opponents in the most recent provincial election, will be able to work together on different issues of importance to Timmins.
Well, first of all, I've never taken it personal. The reality is that democracy is anybody who wants to run has a right to do so. So if it's Mayor Black or it's Mayor Spacek or it's Mike Doody or any of the other candidates that ever ran against me, I think, that's great. That's what democracy is all about. I don't think they or I hold any grudges after the election. I never have. And I know in dealing with all of those individuals that ran against me in the past, they've never held grudges either. So we continue to work together. Why? Because at the end, I think we all recognize there's so few of us in Northern Ontario to be able to do so much when it comes to dealing with federal and provincial governments. We don't have time to fight amongst each other. So during elections, damn right, we'll, take our gloves off and we'll duke it out according to our beliefs and according to our party lines. But in between elections, there's so few of us that we need to work together. And in fact, I've worked quite well with Mayor Spacek, who was the candidate in the previous election, to Mr. Black, and I've already started working with Mr. Black on a number of issues, and I'm sure that we're going to have a strong relationship in the same way that I did with Tom or any other mayor that we've had in the city of Timmins.
Bill Kirk would like to know if you could share your thoughts on the recent announcement by Glenn Thibeault that he's resigned his seat in Ottawa as an NDP member of Parliament from Sudbury and will now be running as a Liberal in a provincial by-election.
Well, I think it took us all by surprise that nobody expected, first of all, that Mr. Cimino, so short after an election, would resign, both because of, family pressures at home and his own health issues. He decided that he couldn't do his job, and I think we have to take that at face value. I wish that was not the case, but it is, and I think we have to accept it. Nobody thought for a million years that Mr. Thibeault would be the candidate for the Liberal Party provincially. He spent a lot of time, along with other Northern members, criticizing the Liberal policies that have so much hurt Northern Ontario, everything to do with what's happened in mining or what's not happened in mining because of what this government has done, and what's happened with the rest of the Northern economy in regards to what these Liberals have done. So nobody saw this coming because he was a strong advocate against a lot of what the Liberal government did. So it brings you to the question is, why did he do it? And I think that his own reasons are personal in the sense that it's about him and it's not about Northern Ontario, it's not about Sudbury. He obviously wanted to move away from the federal politics for reasons that he's enunciated, and he decided the best way to do that was to run as a Liberal provincially, and I think that will not bode well with most voters. I think most of us expect us to be true to our word. We're not always going to agree in politics with our constituents, and our constituents are not always going to agree with us, but they expect you to be true to your word and to follow through on the things that you believe in. And in this case, Mr. Thibeault seems to be following his personal ambition and his personal gain more so than he is trying to follow what's good for people of Northern Ontario. So there will be a by-election. I can tell you I and other New Democrats around Northern Ontario will be spending time in Sudbury in order to do all we can in order to be able to re-win that seat, and certainly don't want to see Mr. Thibeault win that seat as somebody who's decided to cross the floor in the way that he has. I think most people don't see that well.
I would like to thank Mr. Bisson for being our guest today and would like to encourage you to submit your questions for future editions of Queen's Park Q&A. My name is Frank Rock, and this is Speaking of Timmins.